Hi there. So you just bought an orchid or you were gifted an orchid and you're wondering what to do with it now. Well, first of all, just enjoy the flowers. Don't do anything yet. You don't want to repot it until the flowers have died and fallen off. The reason is if you do repot it any sooner, you could cause the flowers to drop prematurely. And you don't want that to happen. It's not a big deal if you have to repot it or you do repot it, but right now just enjoy the flowers and let it do its thing. So as soon as the flowers drop off, it's time to repot. And the reason why is, well, when you buy it, a lot of times they're in a decorative pot, but if you pull it out of the decorative pot, you'll see that it's in a plastic sleeve. And then generally the roots are wrapped in sphagnum because it keeps moisture in when it's transported and it's at the store. So the first thing you want to do is look for any mushy roots. And when I say mushy, that's brown or shriveled. These roots all look pretty darn good. They're all firm, right? There's a little bit of brown one there, but I'm going to leave it. And then you're going to want to remove the sphagnum moss. Now, it's not important that you remove all of it. You're just going to want to get some of it out in between the roots. Sometimes it's a little difficult, but you sort of want to, it's almost like teasing a root ball. So sometimes it's easier to go from underneath. You know, I'm trying to be careful because I don't want to break any of the orchid roots. You know, unlike a pot that you're transplanting, it's okay that some of the roots are circling. If you try to detangle these roots or get them from uncircling around, you're probably going to cause more damage than not. So I'm just going to pull a little bit more off here. That's fine. Now, some people may choose to plant in a sphagnum moss, and the reason I don't recommend planting that is most people kill their plants by overwatering, and sphagnum holds a good amount of water. So if you tend to overwater your plants, you may rot out your orchid. So I'm just going to keep going at this a little bit more. There we go. I mean, I'm happy with that. Got a good amount out, loosened them up. And like I said, these roots are pretty tight, but I don't want to damage too many of the roots. So what else can you plant your orchid in? Just going to leave that there. Orchid bark. Now, it's not landscaping bark. It is something specific for orchids. And of course, there's different brands and different grades of it. Usually the orchid bark you find at nurseries isn't the best quality, but if you find orchid bark online, you could get a good quality. That comes in large, medium, and small, and it really just depends on the orchid that you're growing based on what size bark you get. I like using medium to large bark, and you can see here that this is actually considered medium, and then this is a large bark. What I also like to do is, okay, so once you find a pot, now what can you plant it in? You don't want to plant your orchid in a pot that's too big. Never overpot your orchids. It could hold too much moisture and the roots could rot out. You could use plastic, you could use terracotta, you could use ceramic. It has to have a drain hole. There are certain pots that are orchid pots and they're gonna have extra holes for aeration, or there'll even be plastic pots with slats and a lot of drainage. Now, the reason why is orchids are epiphytes, meaning in nature they grow up in the canopies of trees, and that's why a lot of times you see the roots outside of the pots. So in the wild, they're not really growing in soil, and you're trying to mimic whatever substrate they're growing on the side of a tree. Bark, sphagnum moss, which would be like plant debris that's fallen up in the canopy of the tree. So pot just slightly bigger with at least one drain hole. And then you have your planting media, which is either sphagnum or it is orchid bark. Now, another thing I like to do, so this is the pot I'm going to use, just slightly bigger than my root ball. At the bottom of the pot, I like to put one of two things. If I'm afraid the pot's going to tip over, I'm going to want some weight at the bottom of it. So I'm going to use broken terracotta pot shards. I'm sure we all have pot shards left around. So you could put those in the bottom of the pot to weigh it down. Or you could use packaging peanuts. The reason you use packaging peanuts or the broken pot shards is if this bark breaks down, or when it does, because it's going to, and you don't transplant it in time, it becomes almost like the plant growing in soil. And you don't want that. You want the plant, the orchid roots, to be around a lot of airspace and have good drainage and airspace. So the terracotta pots and of course packaging peanuts won't break down. So if the bark breaks down, you don't transplant it in time, it's gonna have that airspace. It's not a must. You know, if you're really good at transplanting your plants on time before the bark breaks down, then you don't need that. but the terracotta is also good for weight. So I'm going to put just a few of the packaging peanuts down. All right, just enough. Then I'm going to take my orchid root ball that I've sort of detangled and gotten the sphagnum moss, checked for the roots, and then I'm going to put it in there. Now, don't be worried if some of the roots are exposed. Remember, in nature, they're going to grow like that. As long as the majority of the roots are in the pot, you are good. Now I'm going to backfill with bark. Now, ideally, you would soak the bark overnight in good quality water, room temperature water, to really saturate that. But I didn't do that. And I'm just going to fill in the bark all the way around. Just going to sort of tap it all the way around. Now this is different than if you were transplanting an already, established orchid, and that'll go into in a different video because it is different. Here I didn't disturb the roots or really cut any roots off because they were all healthy. But a lot of times when you're transplanting an established orchid, you're going to have a lot more root pruning to do. So I'm just going to tap that down. All right. It's a good way to get all the bark to fill in the air spaces. Now, say this plant was finished flowering. A lot of times people wonder, what do you do with the flower stalk? It's going to be green still. So there's one of two things you could do. Sometimes the flower stalk will just brown down and you'll just cut it down at the base. Other times when the flowers die, you'll notice new buds forming. You can leave them, but almost generally when they do a second bloom after their first initial spike, you only get about 2 or 3 flowers. You're not going to get the majority like you do with a full new spike. So I almost always cut them back. Don't worry about cutting it if it's still green. You could do that, it's okay, but remember, sterilize your pruners. And of course, you're gonna water it in as soon as you put the bark in. Use good quality bottled water, rainwater, reverse osmosis water, if you're in an area with chlorinated water or high boron or high calcium water. And you're gonna water so the water flows all the way out the bottom. And generally, you're going to want to do that again so the bark is completely saturated. And then just put it in a sunny location inside. A south window is ideal, but in the spring and summer, make sure it's a few feet away from the window because it can get too hot. An east window is also ideal. And when do you water it? Well, that's when the bark dries out. You don't want the leaves to wrinkle. That could indicate that it's getting too much water or not enough water. I'm not a big fan of the ice cube method because that's frozen water that you're putting directly on top of roots, and that could freeze and burn the roots. Plus, it's most likely not enough water either. So these are Phalaenopsis. They're the easiest orchids to grow inside. But yeah, enjoy the flowers, but then quickly get it out of that sleeve and into the proper planting media.